I'm recording this because I no longer work in hospice medicine. Officially, my hospital said I left due to burnout. That explanation is neat, comfortable, and easy to file away. It also isn't true. I practiced medicine for almost 25 years. 7 of those were in hospice. If you've never worked in hospice, you should know this. First, it's not where mysteries are supposed to exist. We don't diagnose. We don't chase answers. We manage symptoms, paperwork, and the final stretch of a life that's already been documented and decided. Hospice is where medicine stops asking questions and starts following instructions. That's why the last patient I cared for unsettled me so quickly. Her name, according to the chart, was Eleanor Briggs, 74 years old, end-stage congestive heart failure, chronic kidney disease, Medicare approved, DNR signed, advanced directive on file, family present. Everything about her admission was clean. Perfect, actually. Too perfect for a place that usually runs on loose ends and quiet compromises. I met her on a Tuesday morning during routine rounds. Room 3B. She was sitting upright in bed, hands folded, watching the hallway rather than the television. When I introduced myself, she smiled, nodded, and thanked me for coming. Patients say that sometimes, but usually with relief or nerves attached. Eleanor's tone was neutral, like she was acknowledging a delivery. She knew why she was there. She knew what hospice meant. She didn't ask how much time she had left. She didn't ask about comfort meds or family visiting hours. She didn't ask anything. She listened. Then she said, "I understand the process." That wasn't unusual on its own. What stood out was how she said it. No fear, no bargaining, no denial, just confirmation. Her vitals were stable for someone who shouldn't have been. Her pain assessment was consistent and accurate. Not optimistic, not dramatic, just precise. Nurses appreciate that. So do doctors. There's nothing worse than guessing at pain when the clock is already running out. The nursing notes from the night before were uneventful. No confusion, no agitation, no sundowning. That alone was enough to make me pause. End-of-life patients almost always show some cognitive drift. Eleanor didn't. She was clear-oriented and calm in a way that didn't match her condition. Her daughter arrived later that afternoon. She introduced herself, signed the visitor log, and thanked the staff repeatedly. She did all the things family members are supposed to do. She held Eleanor's hand. She asked about comfort. She asked how to reach the nurse's station. What she didn't do was reminisce. No stories, no shared jokes, no shorthand language that comes from decades of knowing someone. I've seen estranged families. I've seen complicated ones. This wasn't that. It was polite, structured, like a meeting. That evening, I reviewed Eleanor's chart more carefully. Not because I was suspicious, because something felt unfinished, and hospice teaches you to close loops. Her medical history existed, but only in fragments. Annual checkups, basic labs, no long-term primary care physician, no clear progression of disease until recently. It wasn't impossible, just thin. Her admission paperwork was flawless. The signatures were in the right places. Dates lined up. Insurance eligibility was current. The system had accepted her without hesitation. In hospice, that acceptance is final. Once someone is in, we don't reopen the question of whether they belong. I told myself that's what professionalism looks like. Trust the system, trust the process, focus on comfort. Still, when I checked on her later that night, she was awake, staring at the same stretch of hallway. She asked me if everything was proceeding as expected. That was her phrase. Proceeding. Not improving, not worsening, proceeding. I made a small joke about hospice not being big on surprises. She smiled but didn't respond. Humor usually lands somewhere, even if it falls flat. This didn't land at all. If you're finding this story unsettling so far, stay with me. Stories like this don't announce themselves right away. And if you want more real hospital stories told by doctors and nurses who were actually there, make sure you're watching the full video and consider subscribing. These aren't the stories hospitals like to talk about. By the end of my shift, Eleanor had become a topic of quiet conversation among the nurses. not concern, curiosity. She followed instructions without hesitation. She never pressed the call button unnecessarily. She thanked staff at appropriate intervals. She slept when expected. She woke when expected. She behaved like someone who had read a manual on being a hospice patient. Hospice care depends on patterns. We learn them quickly. We rely on them. Eleanor didn't break any rules. She followed them too well. I checked her advance directive again before leaving. Everything was valid, legally sound, ethically clean. There was no reason to delay care or escalate concerns. If I had brought this to administration at that point, they would have asked what policy she violated. I wouldn't have had an answer. Driving home that night, I tried to explain the discomfort away. Some patients accept death early. Some families are private. Some charts are incomplete. Hospice teaches you to respect variance. The problem was that Eleanor didn't feel like a variation. She felt like an absence, not of emotion, of history. The next morning, her chart had been updated with routine nursing notes, intake and output, medication adjustments. Everything looked normal. That was when I noticed something I should have caught earlier. One of the administrative forms had been processed in a way that didn't make sense. The date sequence wasn't wrong enough to trigger an alert, just wrong enough to exist quietly. I stared at it longer than I should have, not because it proved anything, because it didn't. Hospice is built on the assumption that lives arrive with weight. Eleanor's paperwork carried none, only structure. And that was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with a difficult patient or an unusual family. I was dealing with something the system had accepted without ever asking who it belonged to. I closed the chart. I didn't flag it. Not yet. In hospice, once you pull a thread, you're responsible for what comes loose. I shut down the chart and walked back onto the unit with the uneasy feeling that comes when you notice a problem but don't yet know what rule it violates. In hospice medicine, rules matter more than instincts. They're the difference between care and chaos, between comfort and liability. Hospice exists inside the hospital system, but it operates by a different set of priorities. We don't treat disease, we treat decline. Once a patient qualifies, the goal narrows to comfort, dignity, and compliance. Every decision is shaped by paperwork that has already declared the outcome inevitable. By the time a hospice doctor gets involved, the system has agreed that cure is no longer the objective. That agreement is what makes hospice efficient. It's also what makes it dangerous. To be admitted, a patient needs a terminal diagnosis, a physician willing to certify it, and insurance approval. Medicare governs most of it, and Medicare is thorough, but it's not curious. It verifies eligibility, not identity. It confirms prognosis, not history. Once the boxes are checked, hospice assumes the rest of the story exists somewhere upstream. Doctors trust that assumption because we're trained to. Nurses rely on it because they have to. There isn't time to reconstruct lives. Hospice runs on forward motion only. That night, I watched the nurses move through their routines with Eleanor, the same way they did with every other patient. Medication schedules were followed. Repositioning was done on time. Comfort measures were documented. No one questioned her presence because there was nothing on paper to question. I reviewed admissions again at the nurses' station. Eleanor's file sat among the others indistinguishable. Same font, same formatting, same compliance flags. If you remove the name, there was nothing about the chart that suggested it belonged to a specific human being. That's not unusual. Hospice charts reduce people to needs. But usually there's residue, something informal, a note about music preferences, a family dynamic, a joke that got written down by a tired nurse. Eleanor's chart had none of that. It was clinically complete and personally empty. I reminded myself that hospice isn't therapy. We don't excavate meaning. We manage symptoms and keep the system moving. That's what families expect. That's what insurers pay for. Anything beyond that risks interfering with care. Still, the system only works if the inputs make sense. The next morning, during interdisciplinary rounds, Eleanor's name came up briefly. The nurse assigned to her reported no issues overnight. Social work noted that family support was present and appropriate. The chaplain hadn't been requested. No red flags were raised. I didn't raise any either. At that point, I couldn't have justified it. Hospice meetings are pragmatic. No one debates philosophy. We discuss bowel movements, oxygen settings, medication tolerance. Death is treated like weather, something to prepare for, not analyze. Later, I spoke with one of the nurses who had spent the most time in Eleanor's room. She described her as easy. That's not a compliment in hospice. Easy patients don't require attention. They don't disrupt schedules. They don't demand explanations. They pass through quietly. I asked if Eleanor had said anything unusual. The nurse shrugged. She asks what comes next, she said. Not emotionally, procedurally. That word again. Hospice patients usually ask what will happen to their families, or whether they'll be in pain, or if they'll know when it's time. Eleanor asked about timelines, transfers, documentation. She asked who certified death and how long the body stayed on the unit. These weren't questions born from fear. They were logistical. That afternoon, I watched her interact with another nurse during medication administration. Eleanor confirmed the medication name before taking it. She asked about dosage adjustments. She thanked the nurse after swallowing, then settled back without comment. It was all correct, too correct. Hospice relies on consent at every stage. Patients can refuse care. Families can object. Eleanor never objected to anything. Consent flowed one way, uninterrupted. I reviewed her advance directive again, line by line. It was detailed, specific, and properly executed. No contradictions, no amendments. It outlined comfort preferences with the kind of clarity lawyers admire. It didn't read like something written in a moment of crisis. It read like a document prepared calmly in advance with full understanding. I checked the witness signatures. They were valid. I checked the dates. They lined up. Almost. There was a small inconsistency that didn't rise to the level of an error. One date preceded another by a margin that made no practical difference. It didn't trigger any system alerts. It didn't invalidate the form. It just existed. Hospice systems are built to flag risk, not impossibility. This didn't qualify as either. I considered mentioning it to administration. I considered documenting it as an observation. I didn't do either, not because I was afraid, but because hospice culture discourages unnecessary disruption. We're taught that raising concerns without a clear endpoint creates distress for families and staff. That's not entirely wrong. As the day progressed, Eleanor's room remained calm. No visitors lingered, no personal items appeared. Her bedside table held water, tissues, and paperwork. No photographs, no cards, nothing that suggested a life beyond the room. When her daughter arrived again, their interaction followed the same pattern. Polite, attentive, brief. They discussed comfort measures, not memories. When the daughter left, she didn't hesitate or look back. I've seen families exhausted by grief. I've seen families relieved by the end of suffering. This wasn't either. It was administrative closure. By evening, I realized something else that hadn't occurred to me before. Eleanor hadn't been assigned a long-term primary care physician in the chart. The certifying doctor was affiliated with the hospital but had limited history with her. That happens especially with late diagnoses. It wasn't alarming, just incomplete. Hospice accepts incomplete histories every day. We don't verify continuity of care. We assume it existed somewhere. That assumption is the system's blind spot. I walked past Eleanor's room one more time before leaving. She looked up and acknowledged me without expression. There was no expectation in her face, no need. She was waiting, but not for reassurance. I left the unit thinking about how hospice simplifies lives at the end. It removes complexity so dying can proceed without friction. The system had done exactly that for Eleanor, and I couldn't shake the sense that it had simplified her too much. I logged back into the system before morning rounds and pulled Eleanor's chart again. Not because I was searching for something specific, but because I needed to see it one more time in the quiet. The overnight unit was still half lit, the kind of lighting hospitals use when they want people to rest, but also want to make sure nothing important gets missed. Her admission timestamp hadn't changed. No new alerts, no addenda. Everything sat exactly where it should have been. Eleanor was awake when I entered her room. She always was. Hospice patients sleep irregularly, drifting in and out as their bodies allow. Eleanor seemed to follow a schedule. She greeted me with the same neutral expression and asked if I was conducting morning assessments. Not how I was doing, not what the plan was, just confirmation that events were unfolding in the expected order. I checked her vitals. Blood pressure a little low, but appropriate. Oxygen saturation steady on minimal support. Heart rate slow, consistent with her diagnosis. Nothing alarming, nothing reassuring either. She was clinically declining on paper, but she didn't feel like someone losing ground. I asked how she slept. She said adequately. I asked if she had any pain overnight. She paused, considered the question, and gave a number that matched the nurse's documentation exactly. Patients often adjust their answers depending on who's asking. Eleanor didn't. It was like she was referencing the same internal record everyone else was. Her room still lacked any sign of personalization. No blanket from home, no framed photographs. Nurses usually encourage families to bring those things. They help orient patients. They help staff remember who they're caring for. Eleanor's room looked like it was waiting for someone else to arrive. I asked her if there was anything she wanted from home. She looked at the bedside table, then back at me and said no. Not politely, definitively, as if the question didn't apply. Later that morning, her daughter arrived again right on time. She signed in, went straight to Eleanor's room, and took the same chair she had used the day before. They spoke quietly. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the rhythm. Question, answer, pause, end. When I joined them, the daughter thanked me for overseeing the process. That phrasing caught my attention. Families usually thank us for care, for kindness, for helping someone feel comfortable. Process wasn't wrong, but it was revealing. I asked if she had any concerns. She said no. She asked if everything was still proceeding as expected. That word again now from the family, proceeding. I asked how long they had lived nearby. She gave a general answer, years. I asked where Eleanor had worked before retiring. The daughter hesitated, then said, accounting. Not a firm answer, more like a placeholder. I asked where. She smiled, apologized, and said she didn't remember the firm's name. Eleanor didn't react. Families forget details under stress. I know that. Hospice is not the place to cross-examine people. Still, the absence of reaction stood out. Eleanor didn't correct her. She didn't fill in gaps. She didn't show recognition or disagreement. She simply observed. After they left, I documented the visit. Routine family interaction, no distress noted. That was accurate. It was also misleading. During afternoon rounds, one of the nurses mentioned that Eleanor never used the call button unless it was scheduled. Most patients press it when they're unsure, uncomfortable, or lonely. Eleanor pressed it when the plan said she should. That night, I reviewed the admission workflow in my head. Referral from the hospitalist, certification by a physician credentialed for hospice, insurance verification, intake assessment, nursing admission, social work, chaplain offered. Everything had happened in the correct order. The system had accepted Eleanor without resistance. Hospice doesn't double-check upstream decisions. We assume the hospital did that. The hospital assumes primary care did that. Primary care assumes the patient's life history exists somewhere behind the scenes. Everyone trusts the previous step. That trust is how patients move through care without friction. I pulled Eleanor's referral note. It was brief. Diagnosis confirmed. Prognosis less than 6 months. Appropriate for hospice. No social concerns noted. No history of non-compliance. It read like hundreds of others I'd seen. It didn't explain anything, but it didn't contradict anything either. I noticed that the certifying physician had seen Eleanor only twice before making the referral. That's not ideal, but it's not unusual, especially when diagnoses come late. It wasn't enough to justify concern. Still, the lack of depth was becoming harder to ignore. I checked nursing documentation from the prior week. No agitation, no confusion, no emotional volatility. That alone put Eleanor outside the typical hospice curve. Even patients who accept death intellectually still show signs of emotional processing. Eleanor didn't process. She complied. Late that evening, I stopped by her room again. She was awake, hands folded, gaze fixed on the doorway. I asked if she needed anything. She asked if medication timing would change overnight due to staffing. That was her concern. I told her no. The schedule would remain the same. She nodded, satisfied. As I turned to leave, she asked who confirmed death when the time came. Not whether someone would be there, not whether it would hurt. Who signed the form? I answered clinically. A nurse would confirm, a physician would pronounce. Documentation would follow. She thanked me and said that matched her understanding. Walking out, I felt the first real flicker of irritation. Not at Eleanor, but at myself. I was letting unease override judgment. Hospice medicine requires restraint. We don't interrogate dying patients about their lives. We don't look for meaning where none is needed. And yet, Eleanor didn't feel like someone whose life was ending. She felt like someone whose role was concluding. Before leaving for the night, I checked her chart one more time. Everything was still compliant, still approved, still valid. There was nothing I could point to that justified escalation. No violation, no risk, no harm. Just a patient who fit every requirement to be there and somehow didn't fit at all. I stopped asking Eleanor open-ended questions after that, not because she resisted them, but because she answered too cleanly. Hospice patients usually wander when you give them space. They circle memories. They hesitate. Eleanor responded like someone completing a checklist. That morning, the nurses reported another quiet night. No calls, no restlessness, no pain spikes. Her vitals had shifted slightly, trending in the direction we expect near the end, but nothing dramatic. What didn't shift was her behavior. It stayed perfectly even. I sat with her during rounds longer than necessary, not to comfort her, but to watch. Silence unsettles people who are afraid. Eleanor handled it without effort. She didn't fill the space. She didn't seek reassurance. She waited. I asked her how she felt about being in hospice. She said it was appropriate. Not helpful, not reassuring. Appropriate, like a billing code. I asked if she was scared. She looked at me for a moment, as if evaluating the question itself, then said no. Not emphatically, just no. Most patients hesitate there. Even the ones who claim acceptance usually show a crack, a breath held too long, a deflection. Eleanor didn't. Her answer landed and stopped. The nurses noticed it too. One of them joked that Eleanor was the calmest patient we've ever had. That was meant as praise. In hospice, calm is rare and welcome. But there was an edge to the joke, a pause afterward that suggested she knew it wasn't entirely right. Later, during medication pass, Eleanor asked the nurse whether the dosage adjustment would be reflected immediately in the chart or after the shift change. The nurse laughed and said Eleanor knew more about documentation than most interns. Eleanor smiled politely and said she preferred clarity. Clarity is something hospice tries to offer families. It's not something patients usually demand. I reviewed Eleanor's cognitive status again. She was oriented to person, place, and time. She knew the date. She knew where she was. She knew why she was there. There were no signs of delirium, no fluctuations, no hallucinations. That alone put her outside the norm. End-of-life physiology almost always affects cognition. Toxins build up, oxygen drops, sleep fragments, the brain reacts. Eleanor's didn't. I asked the social worker if Eleanor had expressed any emotional needs. The answer was no. No spiritual distress, no unresolved conflicts, no requests for counseling. She had declined chaplain visits without explanation. Hospice relies on interdisciplinary care. When one domain is quiet, another usually isn't. Eleanor was quiet across the board. Her daughter visited again that afternoon. Same time, same duration, same pattern. They discussed comfort measures and paperwork. I listened closely this time. There were no shared references, no remember when, no shorthand. Every sentence stood alone. At one point, the daughter asked Eleanor if she wanted anything special brought in. Eleanor said no. The daughter accepted that without protest. Most families insist. They bring blankets, photos, objects that anchor memory. This family didn't. Afterward, I asked the daughter if Eleanor had been this calm at home. She said yes. She said her mother had always been practical, always prepared, always organized. That explanation fit superficially. But people aren't static. Even the most practical personalities soften near the end. They reminisce. They regret. They reach. Eleanor didn't reach. I checked the nursing notes from previous shifts again, looking for any mention of emotional changes. There were none. The absence was consistent, too consistent. One nurse noted that Eleanor corrected her once about the order of documentation. Not rudely, just factually. The nurse had laughed it off and adjusted the note. Hospice patients rarely correct staff, not because they can't, but because they don't care to. Eleanor cared. I found myself growing impatient with the lack of explanation. That wasn't professional. Hospice teaches you to tolerate uncertainty, but this wasn't uncertainty, it was uniformity. During evening rounds, I asked Eleanor if she wanted to talk about anything unresolved. She said there was nothing unresolved, not in her life, not in her care. I asked if she was worried about her daughter. She said her daughter was capable. She said it the way someone might describe a colleague, not a child. I tried humor again. I said most parents don't stop worrying even at the end. Eleanor smiled and said that worrying serves a purpose only when action is possible. That response didn't come from fear or denial. It came from calculation. As I left her room, one of the nurses stopped me and asked quietly if Eleanor struck me as unusual. She said it carefully, like she didn't want to sound unkind. I asked what she meant. The nurse said Eleanor felt like she was passing through, not finishing. That phrasing stayed with me. Hospice patients usually occupy their space. They leave traces. Eleanor left none. Her room reset itself. Nurses cleaned, but there was nothing personal to preserve. I pulled Eleanor's pain assessments again. Consistent, accurate, no escalation. Pain is subjective. Even patients trying to be stoic reveal discomfort eventually. Eleanor didn't. That night, I reviewed her labs from the hospital admission that triggered hospice referral. They supported the diagnosis. Nothing looked fabricated or manipulated. The disease was real. The decline was real. What didn't feel real was the person experiencing it. Hospice medicine forces you to accept contradictions. Patients can be dying and stable at the same time. Families can be grieving and relieved. But there is always an emotional current. Eleanor had none. I considered whether depression could explain it. But depression in hospice looks different. Flat affect, yes, but also withdrawal, sadness, loss of interest. Eleanor wasn't withdrawn. She was engaged, just not emotionally invested. I considered whether medication could be suppressing effect. It wasn't. Her regimen was minimal. By the end of the shift, I realized I was tracking Eleanor the way I track equipment failures, not to assign blame, but to understand why something designed to behave unpredictably was behaving exactly the same way every time. Hospice depends on variability. Eleanor removed it. Before leaving, I stopped by her room one more time. She was awake as usual. She asked if there had been any changes to the plan. I told her no. She nodded, satisfied. As I walked away, I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit earlier. I wasn't unsettled because Eleanor wasn't afraid of dying. I was unsettled because she didn't seem to be losing anything by doing it. I went straight to the workstation and opened Eleanor's record again, this time with the intention of reading it the way an auditor would, not a clinician. Hospice doctors read charts for comfort and risk. Auditors read them for continuity. I switched modes and immediately felt the difference. Her demographic page was complete. Name, date of birth, social security number, Medicare ID. Everything populated cleanly. No warnings, no duplicate flags, no merge history. The system treated Eleanor Briggs like someone it had always known. I scrolled through her medical history slowly. Annual physicals appeared at reasonable intervals, routine lab work, blood pressure checks, cholesterol panels. Nothing dramatic, nothing missing, but nothing connected either. Each encounter existed in isolation, like standalone entries without narrative. Most patients her age have a story written between the lines, a primary care physician who follows them for years, a gradual accumulation of diagnoses, medication adjustments that reflect aging. Eleanor's chart didn't show progression, it showed repetition. I checked provider names, different clinics, different systems, no long-term relationship. That's not impossible, but it's uncommon. People in their 70s don't usually drift between providers without leaving a trail. I opened the referral documentation again. The hospitalist who certified her hospice eligibility had met her twice. The diagnosis was supported. The decline was real. Nothing there violated policy. Still, the lack of historical depth kept bothering me. I moved to the social work notes. Intake assessment completed, family support present, living situation appropriate, no concerns identified. The notes were brief but adequate. They described facts, not dynamics. No mention of long-standing relationships, no description of family history, just boxes checked and fields filled. I checked nursing admission notes. Baseline established, education provided, questions answered. The language was neutral, professional, empty. Hospice documentation is designed to be efficient, but efficiency usually strips emotion, not history. Eleanor's chart had been stripped of both. I looked at her medication list. Short, appropriate, nothing unusual, no long-term prescriptions that suggested chronic management, no history of trial and error, just what was needed now. I pulled up her insurance eligibility timeline. Medicare activation date matched her age. Supplemental coverage present. No gaps, no anomalies, everything lined up. Then I noticed something small. One administrative form had been processed before another that logically should have preceded it, not by much. A matter of days. It didn't invalidate anything. It didn't violate policy. It simply shouldn't have happened in that order. I checked again. Same result. Hospice systems flag errors that cost money or create liability. They don't flag improbabilities. This wasn't an error. It was an anomaly that fit inside tolerance. I thought about escalating it. I imagined the conversation with administration. What would I say? That a form looked wrong even though it wasn't. That a patient felt empty even though she met criteria. There's no drop down for that. I closed the chart and went to see Eleanor again. She was sitting exactly as she had been earlier, hands folded, posture unchanged. I asked her if she had worked before retiring. She said yes. I asked where. She said in an office. I asked doing what. She said managing accounts. The answers were accurate but non-specific, like metadata without content. I asked if she enjoyed her work. She paused, then said it served its function. That response didn't come with emotion. It came with certainty. I asked if she had lived nearby long. She said long enough. I asked where she lived before. She said elsewhere. Every answer closed the question without opening another. I checked the time. Her daughter was due soon. When she arrived, the pattern repeated. Polite greeting, brief conversation, no shared language, no overlap. I asked the daughter about Eleanor's earlier years, childhood, family. The daughter smiled apologetically and said her mother hadn't talked much about the past. She said they were close in a practical way. I asked if there were photographs from earlier decades. She said she wasn't sure where they were. She said Eleanor preferred things simple. Simple doesn't erase decades. After she left, I sat at the nurse's station and compared Eleanor's chart to others admitted that week. Even the quiet patients had notes that hinted at lives. A song preference, a favorite food, a grandchild's name. Eleanor's record remained sterile. One of the nurses commented that Eleanor reminded her of someone waiting at an airport, present, prepared, but not attached to the destination. That analogy felt uncomfortably precise. I went back to Eleanor's room and asked if there was anything unresolved she wanted help with. She said no. I asked if there was anyone else we should notify. She said no. I asked if there was anything she regretted. She looked at me carefully and said, "Regret requires attachment." That was the first time she said something that wasn't just procedural. It wasn't emotional either. It was philosophical, but stripped of warmth. I returned to her chart and looked at the admission consent again. The signatures were valid, witnessed, properly dated, but the handwriting was identical across multiple forms that should have been completed on different days. I compared them side by side. Same pressure, same slant, same rhythm. It wasn't proof of anything. Families sometimes help fill out forms, staff sometimes assist, but the consistency was striking. I realized then that Eleanor's chart didn't just lack depth, it lacked variation. Lives are messy, paperwork reflects that. This didn't. I considered calling Medicare to verify eligibility. I didn't. Not because I thought they would find nothing, but because I suspected they wouldn't know what to look for. Hospice medicine isn't built to ask whether a person exists. It assumes they do. I closed the chart again, aware that I had crossed from observation into doubt. Not doubt about Eleanor's illness, doubt about the history that had supposedly brought her here. As I stood up, I understood something that unsettled me more than any missing document. Eleanor's chart wasn't incomplete. It was complete in a way that required a life to be reduced to paperwork. And the system had accepted that reduction without hesitation. I stared at the form longer than necessary, then minimized the screen and stood up from the workstation without documenting anything new. That was a choice. In hospice medicine, documentation is action. Silence is also action, even if no one admits it. Later that morning, I requested an administrative review. I didn't frame it as a complaint. I framed it as a clarification. That's how you get meetings approved. I told them I wanted to make sure everything about Eleanor's admission was compliant. That word opens doors. The meeting took place in a small conference room off the main hallway. 2 administrators, 1 compliance officer, 1 ethics committee representative on speakerphone. Everyone was polite. Everyone thanked me for my diligence. I summarized Eleanor's case clinically. Diagnosis, prognosis, admission pathway, no emotional language, no speculation. I pointed out the thin medical history, the lack of continuity, the minor timing anomaly in the paperwork. I didn't say what I felt. I said what I could prove. The response was immediate and unanimous. Everything was compliant. The compliance officer explained that hospice eligibility is determined by current condition, not lifetime medical narrative. The administrator reminded me that our role was comfort, not investigation. The ethics representative said there was no evidence of harm or coercion. They weren't wrong. I asked if anyone had concerns about identity verification. The administrator said identity had already been verified upstream. The system assumes validity unless proven otherwise. I asked if there was a process for questioning that assumption. There wasn't. Hospice ethics focuses on consent autonomy and relief of suffering. Eleanor had consented. She was autonomous. She reported no suffering beyond what was managed. From an ethics standpoint, the case was closed. I asked if anyone objected to continued care. No one did. I asked if anyone recommended escalation. No one did. I asked if there was any justification for delaying services. There wasn't. The meeting ended with reassurance. I was thanked again. I was told to focus on patient comfort. I was told that raising questions without clear endpoints can create unnecessary distress. That line stayed with me. Unnecessary distress. After the call, I sat at my desk and opened Eleanor's chart again. Everything looked the same. Still approved, still valid, still accepted. I considered my remaining options. I could call Medicare directly and ask about eligibility verification. I could contact Social Security and inquire about identity confirmation. I could escalate outside the hospice system. I also knew what would happen if I did. Those systems don't respond to unease. They respond to discrepancies. They would see a valid record and close the inquiry. Or worse, they would flag me for inappropriate use of resources. Hospice medicine doesn't protect whistleblowers. It protects flow. That afternoon, I spoke with one of the senior nurses privately. I asked if Eleanor seemed unusual to her beyond being calm. She hesitated, then said Eleanor felt pre-approved. She laughed when she said it, like she knew it sounded strange. I asked what she meant. The nurse said most patients arrive carrying years of unresolved emotion. Eleanor arrived finished. I checked with social work again. No concerns, no follow-up recommended, family appropriate, housing appropriate, end-of-life planning complete. The system had reviewed itself and found no fault. I went to see Eleanor again. She greeted me, asked if the review had concluded, and thanked me for ensuring everything was in order. I hadn't told her about the meeting. She hadn't been informed. I asked how she knew. She said processes tend to resolve on predictable timelines. I asked if she had ever worried about eligibility. She said no. I asked if she had ever feared being denied care. She said denial requires misalignment. That wasn't an answer a patient gives. I told her that everything was proceeding normally. She nodded, satisfied. That word again. Later that evening, I sat alone in my office and stared at the phone number for Medicare Provider Services. I typed it into my phone. I didn't press call. I tried to articulate why. It wasn't fear of being wrong. It wasn't loyalty to administration. It was the realization that the system had already decided Eleanor belonged, and systems don't like being questioned by individuals. Calling would not clarify Eleanor's past. It would only mark me as a disruption. Hospice doctors learn early that survival inside the system requires restraint. You pick your battles, you accept limits. You protect your ability to provide care by not challenging foundations you can't replace. I closed my phone and returned it to my pocket. That night, Eleanor's condition declined slightly. Nothing dramatic. The nurses adjusted medication, comfort maintained, documentation updated. I read the nursing notes at the end of the shift. Still no distress, still no confusion, still no emotion. The ethics committee had spoken, administration had spoken, compliance had spoken, the system had concluded its review. Everything was fine. That was the moment I understood that nothing about this case would be resolved by procedure. The process had already done what it was designed to do. It had removed the question. I kept my head down for the rest of the week and did what hospice doctors are good at doing. When something doesn't fit, I worked. I rounded. I adjusted medications. I answered pages. I documented. I let Eleanor's care proceed without interference. Outwardly, nothing changed. Internally, I started listening differently. Hospice has its own informal communication network. It's not charted, it's not scheduled. It happens in hallways, break rooms, and conference centers between sessions that are supposed to be about pain management and billing updates. That's where people say what they won't put in writing. A few days later, I attended a continuing education conference for hospice physicians and senior nurses. It was routine, required credits, familiar faces, the kind of event where everyone pretends they're not thinking about work while talking about nothing else. During a break, I found myself standing with a group of physicians from different facilities. We talked about staffing shortages, documentation burdens, and how hospice had become more about compliance than care. Standard complaints, safe territory, Someone mentioned a patient who had been oddly easy. That phrase again, easy. Another doctor nodded and said she'd had one like that a few years back. No family drama, no emotional distress, perfect paperwork. She said it felt like the patient had arrived already resolved. A nurse nearby overheard and said quietly that she remembered a case where no one could recall anything personal about the patient after discharge. Not because they didn't try, because there was nothing to recall. The conversation stalled. No one pushed further. I asked casually if anyone had ever felt like a hospice patient didn't have much of a history behind them. I kept my tone light, curious, not accusatory. One doctor looked at me for a moment longer than necessary and said, "Those cases don't go anywhere good." Another nurse said, "You learn to let them pass." No one elaborated. Later, during a session on documentation efficiency, I sat next to a social worker from a different state. We chatted about intake assessments. I mentioned how some charts feel thin. She smiled tightly and said, "Some lives don't leave much paperwork." I asked if that bothered her. She said it used to. That was the closest thing to an answer I got. Back at my facility, I paid closer attention to how staff talked about Eleanor when they thought I wasn't listening. They didn't describe her as difficult or concerning. They described her as smooth, predictable, low maintenance. One nurse said Eleanor was the kind of patient administrators love. No complaints, no complications, no family conflict. Another said she wished all patients were like that. No one said Eleanor felt human. I reviewed Eleanor's chart again that evening, not looking for errors this time, but for patterns. Everything remained stable. Her decline was slow, consistent, and medically plausible. There were no sudden changes that would prompt review or intervention. Hospice systems are built to handle gradual deterioration. Sharp deviations get attention. Eleanor never deviated. I checked the facility census. We had admitted 3 other patients around the same time. All of them had messier charts, complicated family notes, medication changes driven by distress, calls logged at odd hours. Eleanor's file remained quiet. I asked one of the night nurses if Eleanor ever talked when she thought no one was listening. The nurse laughed and said Eleanor didn't talk unless spoken to. She said it wasn't rude, it was just contained. Contained is not a word nurses use lightly. I began to wonder how many times this had happened before, not just here but elsewhere. How many patients had moved through hospice without friction because nothing about them triggered concern? How many had been processed cleanly and forgotten? Hospice medicine doesn't have a mechanism for pattern recognition across institutions. There's no registry for patients who leave no impression, no database for lives that arrive without residue. I considered reaching out to colleagues directly. I drafted an email in my head that asked too much. Have you ever had a patient who felt empty? I didn't write it. Questions like that don't travel well. Eleanor's daughter continued to visit on schedule. Her demeanor never changed. No escalation, no distress, no collapse. She asked about paperwork deadlines and body transfer procedures. She never asked about memories. One afternoon, I overheard a nurse explain to her how death would be documented. The daughter listened carefully, nodded, and thanked her. There was no visible reaction. Families often rehearse grief privately. I told myself that. Still, the lack of variation was striking. I started noticing how often staff deferred to Eleanor's understanding of process. Nurses explained less. They assumed more. Eleanor rarely needed clarification. Hospice usually slows people down. It forces them to confront uncertainty. Eleanor moved through it like someone following a plan she already knew. At the end of the week, I checked Eleanor's vitals and noted another slight decline. Still nothing dramatic, still within expectation. The nurse asked if I wanted to adjust the comfort plan. I said not yet. As I documented, I realized something unsettling. If Eleanor died tomorrow, there would be nothing to investigate. No red flags, no unresolved issues. The system would close the case and move on, and no one would remember her beyond a name on a discharge log. That realization made something settle into place. Not certainty, acceptance. This wasn't a rare anomaly. It was a type of case the system absorbed quietly. Not because it was hidden, but because it didn't disrupt anything. Hospice had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had made Eleanor's presence unremarkable. And that was the most disturbing part. I noticed the change before the monitors did. Eleanor's breathing slowed in a way that wasn't dramatic, just precise. Hospice nurses learned the difference between sudden decline and scheduled decline. And this was the latter. The body was following expectations. The timing was almost exact. The nurse on duty adjusted her position and checked comfort measures. Eleanor acknowledged the change with a nod. No grimace, no resistance. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't reach for anyone. She remained present. Her daughter arrived within the hour. Not rushed, not frantic. She signed in, walked straight to the room, and took her usual seat. The nurse explained what we were seeing. The daughter listened, nodded, and asked if documentation would be completed today or overnight. That question caught the nurse off guard for a second. She answered professionally. Eleanor didn't react. I entered the room shortly after. Eleanor looked at me and said, "This appears to be the appropriate window." That was how she phrased it. Window. I asked if she was comfortable. She said yes. I asked if she needed anything adjusted. She said no. She asked if all orders were current. I confirmed they were. Hospice deaths usually come with some emotional friction. A family member who isn't ready, a patient who rallies briefly, a sudden pain spike. Eleanor's death had none of that. It unfolded like a checklist being completed. Her breathing slowed further. The nurse explained what to expect. The daughter thanked her. Eleanor listened, eyes open, expression unchanged. When Eleanor stopped breathing, there was no confusion about what to do. The nurse confirmed absence of respirations. I confirmed absence of pulse. Time of death was recorded. The paperwork moved forward. The daughter stood, straightened her coat, and asked about next steps. She didn't cry, she didn't linger, she didn't need reassurance. She asked about the body transfer timeline and thanked us for our care. Hospice deaths often leave rooms heavy. This one felt empty almost immediately. Normally, families take time. They sit with the body, they call relatives, they ask for privacy. Eleanor's daughter declined all of that. She signed the necessary forms and left within minutes. I watched the nurse prepare the body. Routine care, respectful, efficient. Eleanor's body didn't resist. There were no signs of distress, even post-mortem. Everything aligned with expectation. The transport team arrived sooner than usual. That wasn't alarming on its own. Schedules vary. Still, the speed stood out. The body was transferred quietly. No delays, no complications. I reviewed the death certificate documentation later that evening. It had been signed along with several others from the unit that day. Batch signing is common in hospice. It keeps things moving. The certifying physician had no reason to question this case more than any other. Eleanor Briggs was officially deceased. The system acknowledged it cleanly. I expected to feel something when I closed her chart for the final time. Relief, sadness, resolution. Instead, there was nothing. The case ended without leaving a mark. That unsettled me more than any chaotic death I'd seen. I checked her chart again after the body was transferred. It had already been updated. Discharge disposition completed. Death summary generated. No pending tasks, no alerts. Hospice cases usually generate follow-up notes, family check-ins, bereavement outreach. Eleanor's file contained the minimum required, no extra entries. I asked the social worker if she had contacted the daughter. She said the daughter declined bereavement services. That happens, not often, but it happens. I asked if that struck her as unusual. She shrugged and said some families prefer privacy. Privacy doesn't usually look like efficiency. I went back to Eleanor's room after it was cleaned. The bed had been stripped, fresh linens placed. The room looked identical to how it had looked before Eleanor arrived. No trace of her remained. Hospice rooms usually carry something of the patient for a while, a scent, a misplaced item. A note left behind. This one didn't. I documented the death and moved on to the next patient. That's what hospice requires. There's always someone else who needs attention. Still, throughout the night, I found myself checking Eleanor's chart again, half expecting something to change. It didn't. By morning, her case had been archived. Routine process. Nothing to review, nothing to escalate. I asked IT later that day if the system automatically cleaned up completed hospice cases during archive cycles. They said yes. Older logs are condensed. Non-essential data is purged. It keeps the system efficient. Efficient systems don't preserve anomalies. I looked for Eleanor's admission forms again. They were still there, but some timestamps had shifted slightly after the archive. Not wrong, just adjusted. Normalization, IT would call it. Normalization smooths edges. I realized then that if I wanted to revisit Eleanor's case in the future, there would be less to look at than there had been while she was alive. The system was already closing around it. Hospice medicine teaches you to accept death as an endpoint. What it doesn't prepare you for is a case that ends without residue. Eleanor's death didn't create questions for the system. It resolved them. As I walked through the unit that morning, the nurses had already filled the room with a new patient. New chart, new name, new story. Eleanor Briggs had moved through hospice exactly as designed. And that was the problem. The system had handled her too well. I didn't intend to look for Eleanor's chart again. That's what I told myself at least. But habit is hard to break in medicine, especially when something ends without explanation. A few days after her death, I logged in out of routine more than suspicion, expecting to see the same archived record I'd already reviewed. It wasn't there in the way I remembered. The chart still existed, but it felt thinner, not missing anything obvious, just compressed. Notes that had once been separate were now summarized. Timestamps were grouped instead of itemized. Access logs that showed who opened the file and when were no longer visible at my permission level. I checked my settings. Nothing had changed. I asked one of the charge nurses if she noticed anything different about Eleanor's record. She said no. She said once a hospice patient is discharged due to death, the system tidies things up automatically. Less clutter, better performance. I asked if older versions could be accessed. She said that was an IT question. IT told me the same thing. Archive migration, data normalization, standard practice. Nothing had been deleted. It had just been reorganized. Reorganized in a way that removed texture. I asked if there was a way to view the pre-archive version. The technician said that level of access was restricted, for audits only. I asked who requested audits. He said compliance. I asked if compliance had flagged Eleanor's case. He said no. Without a flag, there was no reason to reopen anything. Later that week, I was asked to meet with human resources. The email was polite, routine check-in, wellness related. Hospice work is stressful. These meetings happen. The HR representative thanked me for coming. She asked how I was doing. She asked if I felt supported. She asked if I was sleeping. I answered honestly. I said I was tired. That part was easy. She asked if I felt comfortable with my workload. She asked if I had concerns about my role. I said I was managing. Then she asked if I'd been experiencing heightened stress related to a recent case. She didn't say Eleanor's name. I asked what prompted the question. She said administration had noticed I'd requested an ethics review recently and wanted to make sure I had adequate support. Support is a word HR uses when they don't want to say scrutiny. She reminded me that hospice medicine requires emotional resilience and trust in systems designed to protect both patients and providers. She said questioning processes without actionable outcomes can lead to burnout. Burnout again. I asked if there were concerns about my performance. She said no. I asked if I'd violated any policy. She said no. I asked if my job was at risk. She said absolutely not. She then suggested I consider taking some time off. Not mandatory, just recommended. Time off in medicine is rarely neutral. It marks you. I declined politely. I said I felt capable of continuing my duties. She nodded and said the option would remain available. After the meeting, I checked Eleanor's chart again. Another change. The social work notes had been condensed further. The original intake narrative was now a summary sentence, still accurate, less specific. I asked the social worker if she'd edited her notes. She said no. She said the system sometimes does that after case closure. It standardizes language. Standardization removes outliers. I started checking access logs for my other patients. Those were still intact. Eleanor's file was the only one that felt flattened. I told myself this was coincidence. System timing, nothing personal, nothing intentional. Still, when I searched Eleanor's name in the internal directory, fewer results came up than before. Cross-references that had existed earlier were gone. I mentioned this casually to an administrator I trusted. She listened, then advised me to let it go. She said closed cases shouldn't occupy active mental space. She said hospice work requires boundaries. Boundaries are another word for blind spots. I asked if there had been any internal review related to Eleanor. She said no. She said if there had been, I would have been notified. I believed her. That didn't make me feel better. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor's name stopped coming up entirely. Staff moved on. New admissions filled the unit. No one referenced her case. No one asked questions. I tried to reconstruct the timeline from memory. Dates blurred, details softened. Without the chart to anchor them, the facts felt less solid. That bothered me. Medical records exist to preserve reality after memory fades. Eleanor's reality was already dissolving. One afternoon, I attempted to access an old audit log through a different portal. I received an error message, insufficient permissions. That had never happened before. I didn't escalate, I didn't push. I recognized the pattern now. The system wasn't hiding anything. It was doing what it does best, reducing complexity, smoothing anomalies, protecting itself from friction. I checked my email later that day and found a follow-up message from HR. They reiterated their recommendation for rest. They offered resources. They reminded me that patient care depends on clinician well-being. There was no accusation, no warning, just concern. Concern can be more effective than discipline. I stopped trying to access Eleanor's case after that, not because I was convinced I was wrong, but because I understood the cost of being right. Hospice medicine doesn't reward persistence. It rewards compliance. Within a month, my schedule was adjusted slightly. Fewer complex cases, more administrative coverage, nothing dramatic, just a subtle shift. Colleagues asked if I was okay. I said yes. That answer became automatic. Eleanor Briggs existed in the system long enough to be admitted, treated, and discharged. After that, the system did what it always does with resolved cases. It erased the need to remember. I realized then that Eleanor hadn't disappeared after death. She had been resolved, closed, archived. And the more efficiently that happened, the less evidence there was that anything unusual had ever occurred. By the time I stopped looking, there was almost nothing left to find. Not because it had been hidden, because it had been cleaned. I accepted the schedule change without comment. Fewer complex patients, more administrative coverage. On paper, it looked like support. In practice, it felt like a narrowing. My days became quieter, predictable, safe. That should have been a relief. Instead, I found myself watching the system more than the patients. I noticed how easily hospice absorbed new admissions, how quickly charts filled with the right language, how efficiently uncertainty was converted into documentation. The work went on exactly as designed. I still did my job. I assessed pain. I adjusted medications. I spoke with families. I followed protocols. Nothing in my performance changed. What changed was my willingness to dig past the surface. I stopped rereading charts late at night. I stopped comparing notes across patients. I stopped listening for what wasn't being said. Not because I was convinced Eleanor Briggs had been a mistake, but because I understood that understanding her would require stepping outside a system that had already decided the matter was closed. Hospice doesn't encourage that kind of step. A few weeks later, I was offered the option to transition into a different role. Quality oversight, policy review, fewer bedside hours, more predictable expectations. It was presented as an opportunity to reduce burnout. Burnout had become the explanation for everything. I asked if the move was temporary. I was told it could be permanent if I wanted. I asked if it reflected concerns about my clinical judgment. I was assured it did not. Assurance is easy when nothing is written down. I accepted the role. Not immediately, but without resistance. By then, resistance felt pointless. My last week on the hospice unit passed quietly. I rounded on familiar patients. I signed familiar forms. I said goodbye to nurses who assumed I was taking a well-earned break. No one mentioned Eleanor, not by name, not indirectly. It was as if she had never occupied that bed. On my final day, I walked past room 3B. A new patient lay there, surrounded by family, the air thick with unfinished conversations. The contrast was jarring. This was what hospice usually looks like: messy, emotional, human. I stood there longer than necessary, then moved on. In my new role, I reviewed policies instead of people. I approved protocols. I attended meetings. I read reports about patient outcomes in aggregate. Numbers replaced names. It was easier than I expected. Distance dulls questions. Occasionally, a case summary would cross my desk that reminded me of Eleanor, a patient with minimal history, a clean admission, an uncomplicated death. I didn't flag them. I told myself it wasn't my place anymore. That's how withdrawal works. Not all at once, in increments. I stopped attending CME conferences. I declined invitations to speak about hospice ethics. I redirected conversations when colleagues hinted at odd cases. I learned which questions to avoid asking, which patterns not to notice. The system rewarded that restraint. Months passed. The feeling that something had been taken from me softened. I slept better. My workdays ended on time. I no longer replayed charts in my head, and yet every so often I would catch myself looking at a report and wondering what wasn't there. Not missing data, missing depth. Hospice medicine taught me that death is not always chaotic. Sometimes it's orderly to the point of erasure. Sometimes the work isn't helping people let go, but helping systems move on. I never proved that Eleanor Briggs shouldn't have been there. I never produced evidence that would stand up to audit. I never filed a report. What I learned instead was simpler and harder to accept. Hospice does not exist to verify lives. It exists to manage endings. If a person arrives with paperwork that says they belong, the system does not ask how that came to be. It assumes the question was answered elsewhere. If no one upstream raises a concern, hospice will not invent one. That's not negligence, it's design. I tell myself now that Eleanor was an anomaly, a statistical outlier, a coincidence of paperwork and personality. That explanation is comforting. It fits neatly into the way medicine prefers to think. But comfort is not the same as truth. What stays with me is not fear or guilt or regret. It's recognition. There are patients who come into hospice carrying entire lives that spill out into the room. And there are patients who arrive with nothing but documents. Both are treated the same. That's what hospice promises. Equal care, equal dignity, equal endings. What it doesn't promise is meaning. I no longer work in hospice medicine because I realize something about myself. I am not good at ignoring questions once I see them, and hospice requires a certain blindness to function. Some doctors can live with that. Some nurses can. I couldn't. Eleanor Briggs passed through a system designed to smooth transitions and eliminate friction. She did not disrupt it. She did not challenge it. She did not require it to look too closely. In return, the system gave her exactly what it gives everyone else: a clean admission, appropriate care, a documented death, nothing more. When people ask why I left hospice, I tell them I needed a change, that I wanted something less emotionally demanding. They nod, they understand. That explanation is neat, comfortable, easy to file away. And like most things in medicine, it leaves out the part that matters. I didn't leave because hospice was too heavy. I left because one patient showed me how light a human life can become once the system decides it's complete. I've had time to think about that case since leaving hospice medicine. Distance changes how things feel, but it doesn't erase what you noticed when you were still inside the system. Hospitals run on structure. Doctors and nurses rely on protocols because without them, nothing would function. Most of the time, that structure protects patients. Sometimes it replaces them. What Eleanor taught me wasn't about death. It was about how easily a hospital can accept a person without ever knowing them, as long as the paperwork is clean and the process keeps moving. Doctors are trained to treat what's in front of them. Nurses are trained to carry the weight of that treatment forward. Very few of us are trained to ask whether the story behind the patient actually exists. That isn't a failure of individual doctors or nurses. It's a feature of the system. Hospital medicine rewards efficiency, not curiosity. It rewards closure, not questions. And most days, that's exactly what patients need. But every once in a while, a case slips through that shows you the cost of that design. This is why doctors and nurses' stories matter, not because they're dramatic, but because they reveal the quiet moments where the system works too well, the moments that never make it into reports, charts, or training manuals. If stories like this resonate with your EEL hospital experiences told from the inside without exaggeration or spectacle, consider subscribing to the channel. These aren't ghost stories or urban legends. They're the kinds of cases doctors and nurses remember long after their shifts end, even when the system has already moved on. Some patients leave a mark on you. Others show you how easily a mark can disappear.